Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ed Fulner. I'm the president of the Heritage Foundation, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you here to our Allison Auditorium for a very special afternoon session with good friends of ours from the House of Representatives, talking about arguably the single most important policy decision or group of decisions that will be made during this session of the current Congress, and that is, of course, tax reform. We have a stellar lit group of members of the House to talk about this. We are excited to be able to share views with them. And I know Adam Michel, our senior colleague on these matters, will be asking some good, tough questions, and we'll be drawing out both what we can expect and how everybody is really going to come together, right, Mark? And we're all on the same wavelength, and we're all adding and multiplying, not subtracting and dividing at this important time. So, without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn this over to Adam. Will you come up and, or as you decide to do, chair the session, and let's be off. Let's hear about it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We're going to just start asking each of these gentlemen to give a brief opening statement on sort of how they're looking at tax reform, and then we'll dive right in.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Before I get started, I certainly want to acknowledge our Republican Study Committee staff here today with our director, Scott Parkinson, and I see Nolani and Jennifer and Alexa, and I certainly see Jay and Matt, and we appreciate everybody that's being here. Don't forget our comms director as well, just up down the front. But we're very proud to represent such a great group of people, staff, and also members that are now 157. This is something that's been huge and something that we need to take care of. I do thank Dr. Fulner for the kind words. It's always a pleasure to be introduced by the founding director of the Republican Study Committee. As dysfunctional as Congress is now, if you do a little historical research and go back to the 70s, you'll see there were some major problems when the RSC was founded. Dr. Fulner's work in those days with the RSC is really a precursor or game changer in how we can push through conservative policies and ideas in our day and age. One striking example of that is if you will look at Republican Study member Kevin Brady, who is chairman of certainly the influential Committee of Ways and Means. And really what that does, it gives us more access to be able to influence good policy for all Americans. If you told me 10 months ago that we would be discussing tax reform without having passed the repeal of Obamacare, I would probably not have believed you. But we are now in this condition, so that's not only is it strategically important that we get tax reform done, but it's also something as far as following through with the promises that we've made to the American people. As we get closer to the end of the year, I do believe it's urgent, and I would encourage, and I recently have been critical of Mitch McConnell and the lack of ability to be able to push through some of these major items. We do hope that they will not fall down when it comes to passing the tax reform. Before we get into the specifics, let me just address two quick issues here. When it comes to conservatives, the basis of all tax reform. Two principles. First, we agree that government, we do need a government and it needs to be funded. But secondly, we agree that taxes are damaging to the economy. Every dollar drawn from the economy is at the expense of the government bureaucracy instead of the more efficient and invisible at hand. So the concept of hardworking Americans keeping more of not government but their own money should not be a position that's foreign or one that's even offensive. We can contrast this to the liberal notion of taxes, and here's their two contrasting points. One, the basic economic system is unfair, and secondly, the government's job is to level the playing field. We have seen that there's no historical evidence that government picking winners and losers is something that's a long-term benefit. And finally, one of the areas that we want to make sure is focused on is making sure that the marriage penalty goes away. For a family making about $30,000, a married couple, that's $1,000 of additional taxes. So if we truly believe, and this is not a social or moral proposition, if we truly believe that the family unit is a huge benefit, and really societal ills, I believe you can be tracing to the breakdown of the family. If we believe that, then why in the world shouldn't we do everything to promote the family instead of penalize it? Thank you again for Heritage. I look forward to your questions, for allowing us, Heritage Foundation, to be here today. Thank you. With that, I will introduce you and pass it on down to my good friend and gentleman representative that came in the 2010 class, I believe, Representative Jeff Duncan.
Chairman, thank you. And again, I thank Dr. Fulner for having us here at the Heritage Foundation. And Adam, thanks for moderating this. We have a historic, really a generational opportunity here to reform our tax code and make a flatter, fairer, simpler tax system for Americans. When I think about it as a small business owner prior to coming to Congress, just the burden of paying the tax that I needed to pay my government, and the feeling that I had as a small business owner writing that check to the federal government and wondering, is there a better way? What can we do to simplify the tax system, to make my tax rates fair, where I felt better about paying the government the tax I owed? We have a chance to do that. That's something I ran on in 2010, something I hope we can get accomplished. I echo the words of Chairman Walker. I thought we'd get Obamacare done as well. We can't fail on this. There are so many in America that are relying on us to make this happen, so that they can have more money in their paychecks, so that businesses can have more money at the end of the day to reinvest or to spend in the economy. There are some areas that we need to address from a conservative standpoint that I think we're falling short on, but keep in mind, this is a tax reform framework. I look at it as a jigsaw puzzle. So we have put in the outside edges, everything that had a square edge, we have. Now we have the individual pieces that we're flipping over to try to get them to meld together into a package that will actually pass the United States Congress. Things that I want to see may be different than the gentleman on the dais I want to see. But at the end of the day, lower rates, simple tax filings, a fair system that helps America work and puts Americans back to work is the best message that Republicans can carry. So I look forward to this debate and this conversation today, your questions, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, with that, we are grateful to have probably one of the, I don't get the big kid, one of the brighter minds, I would say, from Kentucky, but that would be just you and Rand Paul. No, I'm just teasing with you. But Andy is an incredible speaker, outspoken when it comes to taking our message of individual and opportunity to all communities. It's a privilege to work with him, Representative Andy Barr.
Chairman Walker, thank you. Dr. Fulner, great to be back at the Heritage Foundation as a 1996 intern of the Heritage Foundation. It's nice to return as a member of Congress with the opportunity to do what has not been done in 31 years, and that is to comprehensively reform our tax code to liberate free enterprise in America. Adam, thanks for moderating. The need for bold, immediate, permanent tax reform should be clear to everyone. And it is that federal tax laws today fill approximately 70,000 pages. That's almost triple the number of pages that existed in the tax code in 1986 at the time of the last tax reform when I was in 6th grade. The compliance costs are really out of control. Americans now spend over $409 billion and 8.9 billion hours annually just trying to comply with the broken tax code. And slow growth and increased income inequality over the past several decades is a direct result of this outdated tax code that favors special interests and overseas investment over American jobs and economic activity. And to add insult to injury, our corporate tax system is the least competitive in the world, with a 35% tax rate on C corporations, and on top of that, a non-competitive worldwide tax system that is responsible for an average of 6 annual corporate inversions every year, and is keeping about $2.5 trillion of investment trapped overseas. So the need is clear for tax reform. And just to conclude my opening remarks, what we've already started to hear from those on the left, our friends on the other side of the aisle, and certainly in the media and in left-leaning think tanks, such as the Tax Policy Center, is that our framework, which of course doesn't have a lot of important details yet to be filled in, But the framework is tax cuts for the rich. And you're going to hear a lot of class warfare rhetoric coming from the other side. Well, I want to preempt that for a minute, because what this framework does is, importantly, it doubles the standard deduction. So the first, for a joint filer family, the first $24,000 of income is completely tax-free at the federal level. We're eliminating the 10% bracket, 10% to 0% bracket. And if you actually wanted to produce income inequality, if that was your policy objective, then you would keep this tax code. Because what this tax code does is it prevents upward mobility. The best way we can combat poverty in America, the best way we can restore upward mobility and economic mobility is growth. And this tax code is not designed for growth. The framework that is before us is so exciting because it does hold the promise of restoring economic growth, which is the best way that we can restore upward mobility in our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy Barr. You can tell it means something to him. Probably one of the best and brightest that we've had that come in, the 115th class, is a veteran that we have that's serving among us, is the only freshman on the Republican Study Committee steering committee. It's been a privilege to have. He's added a lot to our team. We're glad to have him here today, Representative Jim Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am very proud to be a part of the Republican Study Committee and proud of the work of Chairman Walker and the others who make up the RSC and the Congress as a vehicle to move conservative policies forward in this Congress. So thank you for inviting me to be a part of this today. And Dr. Fulner, as a young conservative, you were an iconic figure. Now that I'm on Capitol Hill, you're still an iconic figure, and it's always an honor to be with you and to be at the Heritage Foundation, which has led the way for the conservative movement for so long. As a freshman member of Congress, I do have a lot to learn. I'm new and naive. I say that often. But one thing I do know is that right now Congress has a historic opportunity. The last time we've done something akin to what we can accomplish here in this Congress, I was 7 years old, and many of you, I can tell, were barely born, maybe not born yet at that point in 1986. But the opportunity that we have to pass this legislation will lead to a desperately needed period of robust and sustained economic growth. And the reason I say that is because I've seen it firsthand. I've seen what happens firsthand when you pass historic tax reform like what we will be debating and potentially passing in this Congress. I served for 6 years in the Indiana State Senate, and I worked with Governors Mitch Daniels and a guy named Mike Pence as a state senator, and we passed, during that time, during those 6 years that I was a state senator, we passed 2 rounds of tax reform that resulted in Indiana being named one of the top 10 states in the nation for our business climate. Today, Indiana has the lowest unemployment rate in the Midwest. While our state budget is balanced, we have a rainy day fund of nearly $2 billion, and job creators are choosing to come and do business in the Hoosier state because of the tax reform measures that we passed under Governor Mitch Daniels and under Governor Mike Pence. But for comparison's sake, while Indiana lowered business taxes, our neighbors in Illinois chose to increase them. Governor Mitch Daniels used to say that living next door to Illinois was like living next door to The Simpsons, right? So since then, since that juxtaposition of Indiana lowering our corporate tax rates and Illinois choosing to raise them, more than 50 companies have relocated from Illinois to Indiana. And I fear that if Congress doesn't act and the United States doesn't continue to, if the United States continues with some of the highest corporate tax rates in the world like we have today, our country will choose the same fate as what we've seen with Illinois. But what I want to do is I want to bring the Hoosier model to Washington, D.C., and I want job creators to choose to operate here in the United States. Again, I'm new and naive, but I'm very encouraged by this historic opportunity that we have in front of us. There's a great deal to like about the framework that's been released in recent days. As already has been mentioned, the doubling of the standard deduction will promote simplicity and allow the will allow middle-class taxpayers to keep more of their hard-earned money. Lower tax rates on businesses, large and small, will promote investment, job creation, and wage growth. Removing special interest loopholes will allow more Americans to file their taxes on a postcard and promote fairness. And I was very proud as a state senator to be a leader in efforts in our state to eliminate Indiana's death tax, which at the time the Wall Street Journal said was the worst state inheritance tax in the country. And I see Dick Patton here today. He is one of the heroes in eliminating state inheritance taxes. And now we have an opportunity right in front of us to eliminate the federal estate tax as well, just as we did in Indiana eliminating the state inheritance tax. So I'm hopeful that the final legislation, though, while it's historic, it has so many high points. As Chairman Walker said, there are areas that we can make this framework even better by eliminating the marriage penalty, by allowing full expensing to be permanent instead of just for 5 years, and focus a bit more than what the framework already does on helping small businesses. And with those small changes, I believe this tax reform package will help all American families and workers and usher in a new era of economic growth in our country, just like what we've seen in Indiana, making Indiana the envy of almost every other state in the country. So I'm excited to be a part of that. This is what I ran for Congress to be a part of, and very proud to be here today to talk about this important issue.
Thank you. Congressman Banks, you sort of ended on the note that I want to start on. Congressman Duncan, you set up the discussion of the unified framework as these pieces of the puzzle on the outside, and we need to figure out what's going to fit on the inside. Of the sort of items that are up in the air, things that are sort of in flux as part of the framework, are there specific items in the center of those puzzle pieces that are maybe not being highlighted in the discussion, or you think are most pressing going forward that we want to make sure are part of the discussion?
Yeah, so a lot of it has been talked about in the discussions. As Jim said, a postcard to do your taxes on. Here's my income, here's my standard deduction, my mortgage, my charity, here's my tax rate of 15%, here's my net taxes. Put a stamp on it. Here's how much you've collected out of my paycheck, and see, either send me a check or I'm sending you a check in the mail. It should be that simple to pay your government the taxes that you owe them. There's a copy. Thank you. I didn't have that. I like mine better. Wait a minute. But it's the same thing. You can find that online at the Ways and Means site. Tax rates are something that's going to be debatable. We have what Ways and Means and House Republicans have talked about. I think Andy talked about, if you pay 12% now, you go to 0. 15% goes to 12%. Lowering rates, corporate tax rates, S corps, C corps, and how they're treated. LLPs, LLCs. So a lot of that jigsaw puzzle has been talked about. Trying to get it all fit together in something that will pass the United States Senate, I think, is a challenge. But there's a couple things that haven't been talked about. The main thing that I believe is capital gains tax. If you think about Obamacare, and Chairman Walker mentioned Obamacare and our failure there to do what we told the American voter and actually repeal Obamacare. Built into Obamacare is a pay-for, a redistribution aspect to tax capital gains at, 3.9%? Tax experts can tell me 3.8, 3.9% Obamacare capital gains tax. If nothing else, because we don't like Obamacare and we're trying to dismantle it in so many other ways, why not do away with the Obamacare capital gains tax? And that way you reduce that. The other thing is, let's look at capital gains taxes in general. I told leadership that I believe it's a pay-for. Now, how can you talk about lowering tax rates as a way to pay for tax reform? Well, if you look at the 3 times that we have actually done tax reform and done capital gains tax reductions. 1981, we cut the capital gains tax from 28 to 20%. Revenues to the federal government grew by an annual average of 15.8% from 81 to 84. In 1997, the rate was cut again from 28 to 20%. I don't know why we keep raising this. The Democrats in control, they want to raise rates. They think that's the way to generate revenue. We actually cut the capital gains tax rate from 28 to 20% in 1997. revenues to the federal government grew by an annual average of 17.8% from 97 to 2000. So then in 2003, we had to revisit this issue again. We cut the capital gains tax from 20% to 15%. Revenues grew by an annual average of 25.5% to the federal government. So if we truly want to stimulate economic activity, allowing these capital assets to be sold, the seller of those assets is going to reinvest that money. That's what we do as Americans. We reinvest the profits from the capital gain. Somebody bought that asset, and they're going to utilize it to hopefully create jobs as well. And the federal government is going to see an increase to revenue because of the capital gains tax reduction. So I see it as a pay-for. Why we're not having more of this conversation within the Ways and Means Committee and the White House is beyond me. The least, and I go back to my original premise, the least we ought to be talking about is the Obamacare capital gains tax increase.
Thank you. The capital gains side of the equation is, as you pointed out, incredibly important, but there's also a talk of adding possibly a fourth rate on the individual income tax side in the framework. Can one of you speak to how we should think about the possibility of adding this fourth rate in to the discussion and whether or not it's a viable path forward?
Well, one thing that I think people get caught up on a little bit too much is the rate. What's really equally and perhaps more important is the thresholds, the income thresholds where the rates kick in. Because when we talk about lowering taxes for all Americans, not only is that in terms of rates, but where do those thresholds kick in? And I think those thresholds need to go up as the rates come down, meaning that you move to a higher tax bracket, the higher income you earn either as an individual or as a family filing jointly. And so that's a way we can really deliver middle-class tax relief. And, even the framework contemplates a level of progressivity here. And I know the president has indicated a desire for a fourth rate. What I would say is, as long as we're raising the thresholds that kick in at new rates so that we're delivering tax relief, we're lowering the tax liability for Americans, then that's the most important pro-growth factor. The lower the marginal income tax rates are, the less we punish work. And as a member of the House Financial Services Committee, chairman of the Monetary Policy Subcommittee, we do a lot of oversight over the Federal Reserve. And I disagree with Chair Yellen's pursuit of unconventional monetary policy, but one thing as an economist I think she's got right is that the reason for substandard growth, the reason why GDP output is insufficient and not equal to historical standards in terms of recovery is because of low productivity. We can remedy low productivity with lower marginal rates, and if we increase the thresholds so that we're rewarding more work and we're rewarding productivity. So this talk of a fourth rate, if we have a fourth rate that kicks in above $1 million, that might be okay as long as you're increasing the thresholds moving forward. That means you're lowering the tax liability for every American.
We were in a meeting last night with Kevin Brady, and that question was brought up. What's the consideration of the conference? Where does the RSC? How does the RSC feel about this? One of the things that we want to remember is that if we add a fourth bracket, what does it mean for the people that would be potentially moving from upper middle class or middle class, if you use the word class, to that level? Is it going to be a place where it actually penalizes these folks? But the larger component that I want to make here is that we should never be in a position that we do anything based on what our friends on the left think or we should or shouldn't do. And here's what I mean by that. The talking points on the left, the die is already cast. This is going to be tax cuts for the rich, tax cuts for the wealthy, whether we keep that rate the same. In fact, in our cross-sectional lunch with Speaker Ryan today, I made the point, even if we raise that rate 4 or 5 points, you would still have the same talking point. So we want to do what's best for the American people, regardless of the positioning or the messaging that may come out of the left. In fact, Chuck Schumer's already had it wrong one time last week when he put out a statement the very day of our conference retreat, when he said that we were moving the people in the 10% bracket to the 12% bracket. Now, maybe you have, but I've not seen a retraction since he made that comment. But we want to make sure that we are communicating clearly to the American people and making sure that right now we have three brackets that are all moving the people down. We obviously have to still match up the income brackets level with those percentages. I don't see the need for that upper end bracket at this point, but I don't think it's completely off the table if it continues to build, as Jeff said earlier, keeps that border edges on our framework moving forward for overall tax relief and not just cuts for the American people.
Thank you. Congressman Barr, you spoke about the need for productivity growth and that being a big impetus for tax reform. And Congressman Banks, you touched on extending full expensing as part of the tax reform. The framework currently offers full expensing for, I believe it is 5 years. Can you maybe expand on what full expensing means, why it needs to be permanent, and why this should be an important piece of tax reform moving forward?
Yeah, well, I'm struck by the political justification for a mere 5-year full expensing timeline. So I worked in business. I have an MBA, and I'm not sure what business theory or concept would justify a short-term 5-year expensing window that would actually project real permanent economic growth. So businesses will therefore anticipate only that 5-year window and make decisions based on that, when we would reap obviously a greater benefit with a full expensing permanent timeline. So that's one area where this framework, I think, raises some significant questions that hopefully conservatives can advocate for permanent full expensing in the days to come.
And how it in interacting with the productivity growth. We know that investment is one of these important pieces of getting raising wages and increasing investment across America. I think it's full expensing is, as you pointed out, a really important piece. There's obviously a lot of political considerations moving forward with tax reform. The framework doesn't specifically call out things like the state and local tax deduction, but I was hoping we could touch on briefly how critical it is to tax reform to actually help lower rates across the board, and how that piece of tax reform fits into the broader sort of framework that's out there. Is that something that you guys have thought about, how that fits in with the broader reform agenda?
Specific question would be
How important removing the state and local tax deduction is to the broader reform effort.
Yeah, I think it's crucial. It's something that I think, and I haven't talked with all the guys on the panel, but I think we're all in favor of. There are some issues that some of the states in the Northeast have to deal with, because in North Carolina, we're looking at closer to a 1% property tax across the line, and you have New York, it's closer to 4%. So when it comes to deductions both from the state and local taxes and how you work in the property taxes, that's going to be something that's going to have to be proposed and worked through. For example, our friends, I think we had 3 members from New York last night. They were really struggling with what does this mean when it comes to removing potentially mortgage interest rate of the property taxes, because would there be an avenue or a way that they could take whichever one is greater? So these are some of the issues that as far as the finer points, that I don't think have been fleshed out completely. But it is an issue that we want to make sure even places like New York and Illinois, California even, some of the places that people really suffer under state and local and property taxes, that we're not adding to that, but also giving those folks an opportunity, even when their states don't behave appropriately with the revenues that they're bringing in. We want to make sure those folks are looked out for as well.
Well, one thing that I've proposed in lieu of a fourth rate, a higher rate, is to phase out the state and local tax deduction. I think, number one, the state and local tax deduction is a deduction we should look at for base broadening, primarily because it is a provision in the current tax code that rewards high tax jurisdictions. And if we want competitive federalism and we want to reward those states that are more competitive, we ought to seriously look at getting rid of it. And I am sympathetic to some of our colleagues who who represent middle-income, hardworking people who have to deal with non-competitive state capitals. And so for them, you know, perhaps a compromise would be to say, we're going to do away with the state and local income tax deduction. You get your additional progressivity promised by the president in lieu of a fourth rate. But you means test it so that a middle income, say a joint filing couple of a teacher and a police officer in Staten Island in a high tax state, they get to keep it. But if you're a high income person living in Greenwich, Connecticut, you lose it.
Thank you. Building off of that, there's, I'm sure, already a concerted effort by lobbyists that are flooding your office as we move through this process, even without any specifics. Are you implementing any specific strategy to help to talk through the sort of broader tax reform agenda as these things are on the table that may preference special interests? How are you approaching that? Those folks that are coming to your office?
Well, this is politically very popular. So really I don't want to say it's us versus them, but my constituents in my district desperately want us to pass tax reform legislation and tax relief. So when it comes to special interest groups that want to maintain the status quo and loopholes for this special interest or that special interest, it's them versus the very popular public sentiment in my district that the time is now to grow the economy, pass permanent tax reform. So that makes this pretty simple for me. I don't know, no strategy needed.
How many people, you have a fairly large audience here, how many people would like to have more money in your paycheck at the end of the day? That's what it's all about, guys. We're all special interests. Our interest. Having that extra money in your paycheck to spend in the economy, to save for college, to pay down on the mortgage, to build equity in investments. That's what makes America work. We want to stimulate economic activity. And lowering tax rates will just do that. Because I could ask a question, and I won't. How many of you would put 100% of that money in the savings account? Because I know you won't put 100% of it. Hopefully you'll put better than 50% of it, but probably not across America on average. We're going to spend that money in the economy. And we all know how it works. That trickles out, trickles up, trickles down, trickles out. Economic activity means prosperity for this country. Now, I hope we will get into repatriation and what that means for economic stimulus and whatnot, but at the end of the day, it's about you keeping more money in your paycheck at the end of the day, about those small businesses having more money at the end of the year. It's about those large corporations having more money to pay out in dividends or reinvest in job creation. Because right now, the government is taking too much.
Think about the arrogance for a second, if you would, please. We're bringing in $3 trillion worth of revenues, and the arrogance of a bureaucracy, a federal government, that tells the American public, we know better how to spend your money than you do. If you think about that and let that resonate, I hope people that are watching this back home or wherever they may be, think about the mindset of when our society gets to a place that you have citizen representatives going to Washington, D.C. that are constantly asking for more and more money because we know better how to spend it than you do. It should be highly offensive for all Americans.
Thank you. I think turning to this idea of economic growth from the business side of tax reform, Congressman Duncan, you mentioned repatriation and how moving to a territorial system may allow businesses to bring that money back into the United States. I'd like to just briefly touch on how uncompetitive our current tax code is and how the changes that are being proposed can allow businesses to hire more Americans, bring more investment back.
So American companies with operations overseas are hoarding cash overseas because if they bring it back in the country, it's taxed at a very high rate. The better plan tax reform framework has repatriation coming in, I believe, at 0%. I don't know that will stay at 0. I don't know. going to work toward paying for this. There might be a small, at the end of the day, I just speculating, there might be a small tax on the repatriation, but it would be much lower than it is today, and it will be in a way that it still incentivizes that money to come back. If it stays at zero, I'm fine with that as well. What I want is those overseas companies be able to repatriate that money back in the United States, because what does that mean? So a company that has overseas earnings brings that back into the United States, they're going to use that money to either pay themselves if they're a small corporation, pay dividends out to their investors who have taken the risk investing in their company in the first place. Those dividends paid out, and it'll probably be limited on what they could pay out in dividends, but those dividends paid out will either be reinvested or will be spent in the economy. Or, and hopefully this was the key, those companies will reinvest that money in job creation here in the United States. That means building physical plants, physical structures, expanding their operation, buying equipment from companies in Indiana, right? Somebody's got to run that equipment. Somebody running that equipment is more jobs. More jobs means more taxes to the government because people are earning income that they're paying taxes on, and they're spending that money in the economy. They're buying homes, they're buying cars, they're buying groceries. They're working. Job creation, reinvestment in this country is a win-win for repatriation.
To put a face on it, we know that there is over $2 trillion parked overseas.
I didn't know the number, I'm glad.
$2.6 trillion that is parked overseas, that this would unlock for reinvestment back in the United States of America. And I know in my district where I have large medical device orthopedic companies and other companies that have some of that money that's parked overseas, I know what that means in Northeast Indiana. It means more jobs and more expansion, more opportunities for those businesses in my district. That's exciting. The time is ripe for this aspect of tax reform. I apologize. I have to go back to a committee hearing on the House side, so I need to leave you at this point. But thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. I've got one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience. So if you have any questions, be thinking of those. I'd like to end with how your sort of two-part question is. One, how do you see tax reform and your role as the House working with the Senate to move tax reform through? And are there any Democrat colleagues that you've been speaking to that you may see the benefits of the tax reform that we're talking about as a way to sort of move this process through?
Well, I do want to pause for a moment and compliment Speaker Ryan and our leadership team for the rollout and the efficiency that this was rolled out, specifically compared to the debacle that the repeal of Obamacare was. So doing some preemptive work, some proactive work, I think was very crucial in being able to get at least out of the gate, the framework out of the gate. As far as the second part of your questions, yeah, we talked to Democrats who behind the scenes will tell you this is something that their communities need. However, to have our friends transition to the place where they're willing to do publicly, you see there's this adage that I'm sure that you guys are quite all aware of. If Trump is supporting anything, the Democrats have gotten to the place where, regardless of how well it may be for the American people, they're a no from day one. So we hope to encourage them to do the right thing. They have in the past. When I think back to last year, specifically the piece of legislation that comes to my mind may be the Iran deal about as far as where we should allow them to continue to progress with their nuclear. There were 40 Democrats who voted Republican. So I'm hoping there becomes big enough issues where the American people are put first rather than the politics, and hopefully a few of them will join us. Thank you.
See some graphs being drawn down here.
Yeah, so he caught me. I think there will be some Democrats that vote along with this. And to the listening audience, if you know Democrats, you need to encourage them, because every hand went up in this room when I asked if you wanted to keep more money in your paycheck. And that's truly what it's about. They need to get that message as well. This is about stimulating the economy. So there's two mindsets in tax policy. One is you keep increasing rates and the revenues to the government keep going up. There's another that believes there's an optimal point, and that's the Laffer curve is what I'm talking about, what he showed. So as you move along the scale of increasing rates, you do increase revenue. But there comes a point where the rates are so high and progressive, that you disincentivize folks to contribute to the economy. Economic activity falls off because it's oppressive. You know, you're paying 80, 90% of your earned income to the government. Why? Why keep producing that? Or you go underground and you have more of a black market type economy. So we need to find this X here, which is the optimal point of revenue to the federal government and the optimal tax rate that people think are fair to pay their government. And it doesn't get into this repressive, anti-economic stimulus downside of the bell-shaped curve. So, you know, we're shooting for X. We're shooting for that optimal point. But at the end of the day, what the Republican Congress hopes to do is make the tax rates fair for all Americans so that you feel like it's fair and you feel comfortable paying the government. Because we all like the government services of the military and border security, and there are things that government does that we need to pay for. And we want to do that. Finding X is important. So, anyway, you busted me on that. I was just drawing it out as I was thinking about it.
I love the Laffer curve. I'll tell you another reason why Democrats should be in favor of the framework. And I have talked to several of my Democrat colleagues who are in the New Dems or recognize the importance of reforming our broken corporate and non-competitive corporate tax system. But according to the Congressional Budget Office, over 70% of the corporate income tax is passed on in the form of lower wages to workers. Now think about that. Corporations ultimately don't pay or incur the cost of the corporate income tax. It's passed on in the form of lower wages, lower income to their workers, less jobs because they're not creating as many, or in the form of higher prices. That's what happens when you raise the corporate income tax to a confiscatory, anti-growth level the way it is right now. So if you are concerned about income inequality, if you're worried about wage stagnation in America, and many of our friends on the other side of the aisle profess to be concerned about that. We all are concerned about that. I am concerned about my constituents who haven't gotten a raise in 10 to 20 years. Guess how we give them a raise? We make their employers more globally competitive. And that is the best recipe for upward mobility, as I said before. So again, I don't think most people who are struggling in poverty or at the lower levels of income are really particularly concerned about income distribution tables. I think they're more concerned about poverty and getting out of it. And they're more concerned with the lack of upward mobility or economic mobility. Making our corporate tax system more competitive, moving to territoriality, and lowering that corporate rate will make their employers more competitive and make them more able to access the American dream and upward mobility.
And I'll just add to one thing he said. I think the American people are worried about upward mobility. Everyone wants to achieve more in life, move from lower class, middle class, upper class. But they're also right now, in 2017, worried about paying the bills. Because we have seen inflation. Prices have gone up. That means at the end of the day, there's less discretionary income left over to pay for college and other things, which have gone up as well. And so people are concerned about paying the bills. Everything Andy said is correct. Wage stagnation because of the employers and the tax policies of the federal government that affect them, but also the personal income taxes that you pay, meaning that you have less in your net check. And we're trying to fix that.
I would add this final point when it talks about just overall economy. One of the greatest foundational points of any family is purchasing that first home. It's been part of the American dream for generations. Among our wonderful minority community in North Carolina, home ownership went down all 8 years of the Obama administration. See, those are hard numbers. Those are hard data points. Those are the kinds of things that as members of Congress, we need to be working behalf on all of our communities to give them more opportunity to pursue that upward mobility that we've been talking about.
Thank you. With that, are there questions from the audience?
Patrick Wilson, I work for Cummins, an Indiana equipment manufacturer, so thanks for the plug, Congressman. My question is about a recent study by the Business Roundtable that showed that since 2004, America has lost almost $600 billion in value as companies, because of our corporate tax rates, have either inverted or, more critically, have been purchased by foreign entities and taken offshore. I'm wondering what you think the blueprint is going to do to address this question of inversion and the attractiveness of just not being headquartered in the U.S.
Yeah. You repeat the question. I don't think the mic was on for the internet
The
there.
question was, how is our, how is the business tax reform piece of the framework going to address the issue of inversions, whereby corporations are moving overseas for primarily tax reasons?
First thing I'll say is we don't have a competitive corporate tax rate right now. Even Canada is lower than us. So companies still reside in the United States and have their base operations here because it's still the stable, safest economy in the world. But we have seen this meticulation of companies moving some operations overseas. I think if we, and I believe the framework does this, lower the corporate tax rates for S corps, C corps, LLCs, LLPs, you name your corporate structure. We're lowering the rates for them to make them competitive with Canada and competitive with the rest of the world. Because we are the safest and strongest economy, if we change our tax rates and make us competitive with the rest of the world, I think you're going to see more of that operation come back in the United States. That's my opinion, because I believe the reason companies have moved operations over is because of our lack of competition.
And just a statistic that supports that analysis. Only 6 of the 34 OECD countries, including the United States, still employ a worldwide system, down from 17 in 2000. So it's a double insult to American companies. Not only are American companies paying the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world, but our peers are not operating and laboring under this non-competitive worldwide tax system. They've moved to a territorial tax system. So yes, we need to get the rate down. We also need to move to a territorial tax system as well, and I think that would be very, very, very beneficial.
Thank you. Here in the front row.
A quick question. When I was listening to what you guys were talking about as far as possible changes to the Big Six framework, I heard, permanent full expensing, possible lowering of capital gains and dividends, the threshold dropping, the SALT having a phase down. But those all would tend, at least statically scored, to raise the deficit. So my question is the idea that these deficit increases would later be dealt with through huge spending cuts to come later, or is there some other set of pay-fors or changes to the tax code that you would seek at this time to address that?
Yeah, I'll take that. Always, as true fiscal responsibility members of Congress, you want to pay attention to what long-term debt is as well as our annual deficits. With projected growth over the next 10 years, in fact, I believe last quarter, for the first time in a decade, we were at 3.1%. We think the anticipation, as well as this great tax reform, is going to continue to only stimulate the economy. We believe that the dynamic scoring that's being used by the Ways and Means is the proper way to look at this. And do not believe that some of the projections I know that have come out by the Brookings Institute and others is an accurate portrayal, even though one of our guys did use that yesterday. That may be what you're referring to as some of the concerns. We're not buying into that yet. And the other component is that we don't have all the numbers at this point to be able to push back in that arena at this point. So as we put these pieces more and more together, we're not trying to bypass the question, but a lot of this will determine as far as what those nuts and bolts look like as far as how it does break down. And I think hopefully over the next 2 to 3 weeks, yes, you did lay out if all that wish list that you just repeated got put back into it, there would be some other issues. Obviously, we thought we would have another $980 billion of the Obamacare taxes to work with. At first, another $1 trillion of what we thought would be the border adjustment tax. Those are both gone, so we do have to be mindful of that. But to the larger point, we have concrete evidence. Jeff cited 3 different historical examples of when we are able to stimulate the economy through tax relief. It's always a benefit to the American people, and overall revenues grow in general. Thank you.
We got time. Oh, go.
If I could just add one other thing. So obviously, dynamic scoring is important. The reconciliation procedure itself will require, with dynamic scoring, over a 10-year budget window, a surplus. So that's something to keep in mind. So there's going to be, in addition to some revenue-producing tax cuts, like capital gains tax cuts and other growth-producing measures, there's going to be some base broadening as well. And we talked about state and local, but there's going to be others as well. One area that I have kind of cautioned the tax writers on, in terms of of not being too aggressive in terms of the base broadening effort, is on interest deductibility, corporate interest deductibility. I know the objective here is growth, and we need growth both in terms of meeting our reconciliation requirements and because that's what we want to achieve for the American people, is growth. I worry that if we're too aggressive in limiting corporate interest deductibility, we will unintentionally limit the growth potential of this tax reform effort. Why do I say that? Because from a Financial Services Committee perspective, we live in a credit economy. And this is 70% of American employers are non-investment grade companies, meaning that they're debt-oriented. Real estate is a great example of that. Many growth-producing, growing companies debt finance. And there's a reason for that, because the debt markets are more liquid, they're deeper, they're easier to access than the equity markets. And I understand the philosophy of deleveraging companies and making them resilient and strong, but if we overemphasize raising capital through the equity markets only, what that will do is it will require companies to issue shares. And if they do that, their earnings per share will go down. The valuation of their companies will decrease. The great thing about the debt markets is that you can keep your earnings per share going up. You don't have to limit the upside of your stock. The valuation of your company can continue to grow, but you can also raise capital. So the key here is, let's not change the tax code to limit corporate interest deductibility to such an extent that we deprive the American free enterprise system of capital formation. So that's just one comment about the base broadening effort. Yes, we need to do it. I worry that the framework is maybe a little too aggressive on clipping the interest deductibility.
And the last thing I'll say on this is that for too long, we've seen the American economy operate under a repressive tax code. Under the Obama administration, we saw a repressive regulatory environment. It's no wonder we had a very slow recovery from the 2008 market downturn and Great Recession. Recognizing that repression, the United States Congress has, with the CRA, started rolling back some of those regulations. We saw the market respond this spring. I think the markets responded to the hope that we're going to get tax reform done. So if we can do away, we've already done away with a lot of the repressive regulations. If we can do away with or change this repressive tax code to make it more attractive, economic growth is going to be there. So to answer your further point, the whole static and dynamic scoring of CBO is going to cause Congress some problems, because that is going to be a talking point of the left, is the CBO score on tax reform. But if you look at it truly dynamically, the growth's there. The empirical data shows that lower tax rates actually work to stimulate economic growth and revenue to the federal government. It's been since '86 since we've done this. I can point to the capital gains tax reductions and the growth there. I truly believe that lowering income tax rates and making us more competitive as a nation will stimulate the economy enough to more than pay for any lost revenue the federal government may receive from tax reform. I have no doubt about it.
Thank you. On that note, I'd like to thank you all for joining us here to talk about tax reform, and you all for coming out to listen. So thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to Heritage. God bless.